Welcome to today's Galaxy News Network War Update. Thank you so much for joining. News from the Canadian front. Following the recent thwarted terrorist attack on the Alaskan oil pipeline in Canadian territory, our boys have been given the order to annex Little America once and for all. With the majority of our power-armored cavalry of justice being deployed to the Alaskan and Chinese front lines, the spearhead of the advance belongs to the mighty Chryslus Patton main battle tank, Minuteman rocket artillery systems, and of course, our brave GIs. Now please join us for a live look-in at the Patton Vanguard, who are advancing right now deep into the Yukon Territory of Canada. The Patton is a heavy tank developed by Chryslus Motor Group for the U.S. military. The Chryslus Patton is loosely based on the M48 Patton, the first main battle tank, which was introduced in 1952 and named after famed World War II General George S. Patton, a man feared by both his allies and enemies alike. According to the reports from our tank crews at the front and captured communist soldiers and Canadian loyalists alike, this is a trait shared by today's Patton. The Patton is often referred to colloquially as the atomic coffin due to its tendency to be the final resting place for its crew when hit, with either the rivets popping free and tearing men into shreds, or the entire thing going nuclear when the radiator is hit. Her enemies, on the other hand, fear her for her ability to rain death down upon their front lines with her 140mm twin guns that create an eerie staccato of doom. It won't be long now, I assure you. Soon, our mechanized units will conquer the Yukon and bring Little America to heel where they belong. This concludes today's War Report. Thank you so much for watching the Galaxy News Network. Don't forget to tune in next Friday at 7 p.m. to join Armor Ace and the Power Patrol for an all-new episode brought to you by Nuka-Cola. Howdy folks, I'm your host Spydingo, and I thank you so much for joining me on this in-depth look at the Chryslus Patton, the name I've coined for Fallout's tank that graced our lives in Commonwealth of Boston, and then once again in the Commonwealth of New Appalachia. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the intro. It was a lot of fun making it. I must admit though, that it is mostly just my fan fiction, as there's not much known about Fallout's main battle tank, but there are certainly elements in the scenario presented to you that are based on lore facts, such as we know from the modelers that the model of the tank itself was loosely based on the M48 Patton. We also do know for a fact that the United States did indeed invade Canada by force following an actually rather interesting and complex stream of pre-war political events that I'd love to cover for y'all if you're interested, so be sure to let me know if you are. I also believe it's pretty fair to assume that the Chryslus Patton would have been used in the conflict, as she is a tank, and tanks are generally used in conflicts. I know, crazy logic, maybe a bit of a stretch, and because the Patton was fielded domestically, along with the West Tech Hermit and National Guard troops in order to suppress civil unrest in Boston and New Appalachia, as evidenced by the remains of the vehicles rusting away throughout the route. That's pretty much all we know about the Fallout tank. Everything else we must glean either from the model itself or from our own history. Now, let us discuss why I've coined the name Chryslus Patton for this Fallout tank. The first and most obvious reason is the fact the Fallout tank was loosely based off the Patton tank, as previously mentioned, from our own universe that served in Korea. The Chryslus portion is a bit more nuanced, however, and is also based off of a real-world tank concept. You see, at one point in our very own universe, some mad lads had a plan, and that plan was to build a massive turret on some tracks that just happened to be nuclear-powered in nature. This concept was known as the Chrysler TV-8 nuclear tank. The novel TV-8 concept would have essentially consolidated all that is a tank into one large alien-looking turret containing munitions, reactor, and crew in one neat, totally safe package. I'm sure that they definitely took into account the necessary amount of shielding they would need for that nuclear reactor to protect the crew. So, if you put the Patton reference and the Chrysler reference together, Glamco, Mac and Cheesy, you got the Chryslus Patton. Next on the docket, I have for you fine folks some hand-wavy specifications for the mighty Chryslus Patton. She weighs in at an M1 Abrams approximate 60 tons of death and measures 12 feet wide, 29 feet long, 20 without those 140mm gun barrels that is, and has a height of 11 feet. Then, as previously mentioned, she is sporting a nuclear power plant, quite possibly Westech or Mass Fusion in design, and boasts a top speed somewhere in the range of 35 to 45 miles per hour. We know for a fact she can be operated by as few as 2 crew members, thanks to those brave souls that took her for a joyride without their commander's permission. But I reckon she likely requires at least 3 to be fully crewed. Neither one of the 2 soldiers found operating her seemed to have the IQ to be a tank commander, in my opinion. So I'm going to assume that's the crew position that was missing. Finally, for armaments, the Patton is singularly sporting her dual 140mm autoloaded cannons, at least so far as we can tell. But for my sanity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and say she also countered an externally mounted machine gun in her arsenal. With that out of the way, it is now time to move on to my favorite part of these videos, the pros and cons section, where I talk about what I really liked and then rant about what I really didn't. Starting as always with the pros. My first pro has to be the simple fact that the Patton even exists. In my mind, the Patton is the first real tank in the Fallout series. Don't get me wrong, I know other tanks have existed in the universe, such as the Sherman tank from Fallout Tactics, I believe, and of course the Chimera tanks from Fallout 3 Operation Anchorage. I just can't bring myself to count those vehicles as Fallout tanks, however. You see, when it comes to a tank like the Sherman, don't get me wrong, I love me a good historical tank, and the Sherman absolutely fits that bill. Even more so for me considering it is an iconic World War II vehicle. But I can't in good faith count it because that's all the Fallout Sherman is. Another Sherman. It's not unique to the Fallout universe, and it's kind of rubbed me the wrong way when 40s and 50s vehicles have just been copy-pasted into the universe in the 2070s. It just doesn't make sense, and honestly, I hate it. I'm looking at you, Fallout 3 with your P-80 shooting star, even though as a former Lockheed Martin employee, I'm so very tempted to like it. And then don't even get me started on the ancient Enterprise-class Rivet City aircraft carrier. I'm also turning my nose up at New Vegas and its B-29s. Now, in regards to the Chimera, I don't actually have any problem with this tank, per se. It just doesn't really jump out to me as a tank in the conventional military sense, at least aesthetically. Perhaps it would help if the Chimera was painted olive green or some sort of camo to really project that feeling of military, if that makes sense. There is also the little-known detail that the Chimera is actually considered to be a robot in Fallout 3. That makes me hesitant to accept her as a true, bona fide tank. Apologies for the tangent there, but that's where I'm coming from. The Patton is uniquely a Fallout design, has truly loco-for-loco puff design principles, and yet still manages to look like a military vehicle. And I really appreciate that. Next, I feel I must tip my cap to the modeler or modelers of the Chryslus Patton on account of the sheer amount of details on display here. There are rivets for days. A nice bit of visual flavor, if ultimately a truly horrible idea for a tank. Well-defined tracks, track guards, a radiator complete with an enclosure for the delicate system to retract into, numerous mounting points, handles, ladders, railings, and more. It's clear that a lot of passion went into the Patton's design, and I would be truly remiss if we did not take a moment to appreciate that, even if as a weapon system she falls quite a bit short. Similarly, I'd like to call out the texture work done on the Patton. The texture quality is truly fantastic, perhaps not in a 16 times the detail way, but in what is contained on the texture. Often, the texture comes across almost as an afterthought in the Fallout series. Take, for example, the Stingray Deluxe. Her texture has relatively few details, and if it was not for her livery, wouldn't really have any definition at all. The Patton, however, contains a multitude of interesting details, despite the fact the general theme of the texture is just a simple, rusty olive green. Let me go ahead and call out a few fine folks. The turret escape hatch has 78.B emblazoned on its hull. I have no idea what that means, but it's still cool. Similarly, the blisters underneath the turret ladders on either side are labeled A and B on one side and C and D on the other. Then there are the compartments underneath the radiator that are labeled K.T. What could that mean? Finally, I appreciate the visual enhancement that the wires running to and fro on the texture provide to the overall model. I'm also rather impressed with how asymmetrical the Patton model is, which I'm not gonna lie, I feel strange admitting, considering how much I truly do appreciate symmetry. In the case of the Patton, I think the asymmetry works well and adds an interesting level of story detail. What I mean by that is, when you look at either the radiator side of the tank or the non-radiator side of the tank, you get different insights into how the unit possibly could function. On the radiator side, there is, well, obviously the radiator, but also a track guard mounted over the rear tracks that isn't present on the other side. When I see details like this, I just can't help but wonder if on the sides of the Cherry model there was a track guard mounted on both sides, or perhaps on all of the tracks, but only this one survived through the apocalypse to present day perhaps? Then there is the piping that runs from the front of the chassis all the way to the rear on the non-radiator side that simply terminates on the radiator side. That makes me wonder, what the heck was that supposed to do? Is this also part of the cooling system and the unit attaches to its coolant storage tank perhaps? There is even asymmetry when it comes to the turret mounted on the chassis, with the main hatch or cupola being oddly offset to the radiator side of the chassis in such a fashion that it seems like it couldn't actually provide access to anything. That tells the story. In that way, it is both visually and intellectually refreshing, since each angle of the model tells a different story in a way that you don't get with most vehicles, like the Stratorang, for example. My final pro is also a huge con with this model, and that's the elephant in the room. The twin massive guns that are clearly compensating for something. There is no denying, at least in my opinion, that twin guns on a tank looks cool, even if functionally the concept is incredibly flawed. I like big guns, and I cannot lie, and two big guns certainly create more of a visual impact than just the one. I mean, you're not likely to forget what the Patton tank looks like, thanks to her guns. Love her or hate her, you are certainly going to remember laying eyes on her. You know what I mean? Now that the happy thoughts are well and truly out of the way, let's get ready to jump into the con. But first, please go ahead and consider hitting that like button and giving me a subscribe if you've enjoyed the content so far. This content takes a lot of time and effort to take, and every bit of encouragement goes a very, very long way. So please. But also consider getting yourself a drink, because the list of cons I have with this tank are about as long as her guns. Speaking of, since we have already been talking about the guns, let's go ahead and start there. Look, a tank isn't a battleship. You can't just add more and more guns and make the platform bigger and bigger while letting buoyancy do the work for you. I mean, I suppose you could. I'm not really that type of engineer, so perhaps a monster-sized tank like the Baneblade or Hitler's Mega Tank are theoretically possible, but they just simply aren't practical. A tank, unlike a ship, doesn't have the vast emptiness of the ocean to maneuver in. A tank is a ground weapon and is beholden to the increased frictional coefficient that entails, in addition to the infrastructure constraints there are in operating in the terrestrial theater. A tank can only be so big before it can't fit in your Stratorang, or on your rail line for transportation, or heck, utilize civilian infrastructure at all. What this means is, if you put two large guns on a given tank chassis, you are sacrificing the ability to put one larger, more capable gun in their place. In my opinion, and honestly the opinion of the militaries of our world, this isn't a trade-off that is worth making. Sure, perhaps you could fire twice as fast, or perhaps have different munitions ready for firing in either barrel to more quickly engage targets with the most effective weapon for the job. But does that really matter if the opposing tank has a bigger gun that is capable of eliminating your tank before you even get into range to engage with your smaller guns? I just don't think so. Though the guns are certainly the largest issue I have with the turret, there are still 3 more complaints I have in its regards. The first of which is the lack of a coaxial or mounted machine gun. Assuming the Patton is truly meant to be a main battle tank, the lack of such a feature is unforgivable, at least to me. A tank needs a better way to engage with infantry than to rely on its main guns alone. It's as simple as that. Without such a mechanism, I've got to imagine it would be relatively easy for infantry to get the drop on this beast. I will admit though, it is certainly possible, at least in the case of an externally mounted machine gun, that the gun has simply been salvaged by the survivalists of the wasteland to help aid in their survival in an unforgiving world. The next issue I have with this turret is that of traverse ability. The turret is quite large, and owing to the raised radiator and cowling sections mounted on the side of the chassis, it certainly appears that the turret has a relatively limited range of motion. Although I'm not about to pull out a protractor and the Pythagorean theorem or anything, I think it's pretty fair to estimate that the turret only has around 90 degrees of rotational freedom, plus 45 degrees and negative 45 degrees from centered, in which to engage targets. You don't love that, especially if you have a Chimera lining you up for a kill shot in the tree line 60 degrees off the bore of your guns. Rounding out the issues I have specifically with the turret of the Patton is with the cupola. That doesn't seem to either provide access to the turret's interior or provide sufficient space for a human to simply exist within. I certainly would hate to try and be the tank commander that has to try and do his duty in that cramped compartment, that's for sure. Next, let's break down the numerous problems with the chassis, starting from the ground up with the 2 main problems I have with the tracks. The first issue is pretty unforgivable once you notice it. You heard it here first, the tracks do not have any sprockets, only wheels. For a tracked vehicle to work, sprockets are a requirement, as they are what actually grip the track and move it. A track system with only wheels would have no way to grip the track, and thus would be unable to provide the tank with any locomotion. So I suppose what you have is a 60-ton in-placed gun in your hand, with an extremely limited engagement zone. Woof. The other problem I have with the tracks is their split quad-track nature. Don't get me wrong, I get that split tracks are a sci-fi thing. I mean, just look at Halo's Scorpion tank. It doesn't get much more iconic than that. But the split tracks thing functionally doesn't really work that well. Sure, it is a design paradigm that does have some benefits, namely a theoretically improved ability to cure uneven terrain and the potential for better weight distribution and maneuverability. But it comes with far too many problems, mostly owing to the increased complexity of the system. Inherently, with twice the tracks comes twice the treads, twice the sprockets, etc. This also means twice the maintenance complexity. To make matters worse in the case of the Patton, the tracks are partially overlapping, making the rear set look like a real boogabear to work on, in my opinion. Moving onwards and upwards, let us begin talking about the disaster that is the Patton's armor. Firstly, check out the slope, or lack thereof, of the armor. For the most part, the Patton is nothing but flat sides that have no chance of deflecting incoming fire in the slightest, at least in a positive way. Heck, the front of the chassis doesn't even appear to be armored, let alone sloped. The turret and sides are no better. Practically 90-degree angles abound every which way you look. And as if all that wasn't bad enough, Mother of Adam, look at all of those shot traps that would direct fire into the body of the vehicle. These traps are everywhere, but those fenders are by far the worst offenders and practically form a funnel for directing the incoming fire into the center mass of the vehicle. What a nightmare. Perhaps it's a good thing there doesn't appear to be any vision slits on the chassis, so the crew members inside don't have to see their demise coming. Although I will admit it's quite likely that the Patton has a periscope of sorts mounted on the front radiator side of the chassis, so there's that. Speaking of the radiator, that's my next con. In the first place, I'm not even sure why the Patton has a radiator, but I'm especially not sure why such a critical component is mounted on the side of the chassis. I mean, I do think it's great and all that it can clearly be withdrawn into a protective enclosure during combat, but I don't understand why it isn't situated at the rear. Perhaps this is just my Valkyria Chronicles bias speaking, but putting it on the side is just sheer lunacy, I say. Oh, and just for those of you that might not know, Valkyria Chronicles is an anime turn-based World War II strategy game where vehicles are powered by a highly volatile substance known as ragnite that is essentially the heart and kryptonite of the tank, allowing a savvy tank commander to eliminate the vehicle in a single well-placed strike if they hit the radiator. So that's where I'm really coming from with this con. But even if you take away my Valkyria Chronicles bias, it still doesn't make a lot of sense that there is a radiator on this tank. I mean, we've seen countless other examples of Fallout vehicles that are nuclear-powered that don't have radiators, such as the Vertibird or Fusion Flea. So it really just doesn't make sense that the Patton has this flaw. Now it's time for the final con, and if you've watched me for a while, you know I'm about to go on a bit of a riveting rant. Rivets do not belong on a tank. Although Rivet Funfetti certainly does provide your vehicle with a nice aesthetic pop, it's a death sentence for those inside. Implementing rivets into your tank design is essentially like filling the tank's interior with shrapnel, since on impact, rivets have a high tendency to pop free of the hull and ricochet throughout the interior, ripping the crews inside to shreds. Are there perhaps valid reasons for using rivets, such as using a non-ferrous metal like aluminum for the tank's hull? Sure, I guess, but I wouldn't exactly be a fan of a tank that was designed to hold Nuka-Cola either. Sadly, series after series, time after time, I see this mistake. I guess, like war, game design never changes. I hope you enjoyed my little rant. I made sure to keep it short this time. Now it's time for a section I like to call, What Would Spydingo Do?, where I take a look at some of the cons I just mentioned and quote-unquote fix the design and then present the finished product to you fine folks. The first thing I'm going to do, unsurprisingly, is make the rivets vanish, like Goodwill for Bethesda did with the release of Fallout 76. Then I'm going to merge those quad tracks into the standard dual track configuration we all know and love, and of course add sprockets to the track so the Patton could actually stand a chance at functioning. Next, I'd go ahead and move the radiator to the rear of the vehicle, and similarly remove the cowling that is on the opposite side to free up the turret to have a wider range of motion. Then I'd like to address those twin guns. Here I'd do one of two things. Simply remove one of the guns and increase the size of the remaining unit, or, much like I did with the Chimera tank, install a heavy-duty Gauss cannon. I really like the idea of a Gauss cannon in general, but also here, because I think it provides a better justification for the existence of the radiator unit of the tank. I mean, I've just assumed it is a radiator for the nuclear reactor that is powering the Patton, but as mentioned, there's lots of examples where that doesn't make any sense. So by attaching it to a Gauss cannon, it could be a Tesla-like power coil that is only exposed when charging up the Gauss cannon before shooting, to provide a better justification as to why the radiator is there and not on other vehicles. And also, you get to add a Gauss cannon, and you can't complain about that. And with that, I do believe I'll conclude my changes, although I ultimately would love to adjust the armor to be less shot-trappy and feature a more effective slope. I sadly am not a talented enough artist to do so, but hey, maybe some of you guys are. I'd love to see what redesigns y'all can come up with. Alrighty, now that we have taken an in-depth look at the Chryslus Patton, let's discuss what role the weapon system would fill on the battlefield. The most obvious role would be that of the main battle tank, but I feel the Patton would be woefully suited for such a role. Although she has two potentially devastating guns, she has almost no ability to adjust targets with her turret, and has very little survivability owing to her thin, non-sloped armor, and has no secondary weapon for efficiently engaging infantry or light vehicles. So this, to me, leaves the Patton a singular role on the battlefield, that of self-propelled artillery. This would mitigate the shortcomings of the turret and reduce the necessity for the unit to be equipped with secondary weaponry, as well as reduce the odds that she is engaged directly by opposing armored forces, since she will be operating more to the rear. In this role, the Patton would rain down shells on Uncle Sam's enemies from afar and could operate as a mobile bunker buster. Owing to the unit's ability to fire multiple salvos at the same target near instantaneously for effect, overwhelming the defenses of hardened installations. Finally, before I bid you adieu, I'd like to do a brief comparison of the strong points of a tank, such as the Patton, versus the upstart power armor platforms, such as the T-51B. The tank, owing to its conventional vehicular design, would be able to carry more munitions, have a higher top speed since it's not limited by the locomotion abilities of the human body, be capable of traversing greater distance owing to the same reason, and would have a longer range in terms of armament, as I don't care how large of a gun a power armor unit can hold, it's not matching those 140mm monstrosities, at least at the current scale of power armor. In contrast, power armor would boast significantly higher maneuverability owing to the bipedal nature in addition to the fact that they can fly now, thanks to jetpacks. Power armor also has the advantage of being a significantly smaller target, and a less conspicuous one at that. Coupled with stealth technology, power armor also has a high ambush and surprise attack potential. I would also hazard to guess that power armor has the advantage as far as logistics are concerned as well. Power armor frames are small and can easily be loaded into trucks, trains, and planes in packs of 4 or so, something you can't do with tanks, at least not nearly as efficiently. The final and perhaps most powerful thing the power armor has going for it in comparison to the Patton is its versatility, owing to its humanoid form and opposable thumb. Since power armor has hands, a unit can be equipped with various weapons as easily as a human can, be that a Fat Man or 45 pistol, or perhaps an anti-air weapon. Not really sure what that would be for in the Fallout universe, but I can dream. But even beyond that, power armor can be used for logistics, such as warehouse management, loading armaments into vehicle systems, and what have you. All this to say, I think each platform has a place on the battlefield, and that tanks would not have been rendered completely obsolete by the introduction of power armor, which is good because war never changes. That's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much for watching. It always stuck in my craw that my first video was my most successful video and also the video that has the least quality. I cannot believe over 200,000 of you watched that video, especially with the mic quality that it had. Even just watching it again for the preparation for this video was a struggle for me. All that to say, it's been a personal goal of mine to get back to the Patton and give her the attention she oh so deserves with the quality I'm now capable of producing, even if I have an inkling that this video will not do nearly as well. But at least I'll know that I corrected that injustice. Now I leave you with a final thought. What if the crew inside the tank wore power armor? Spydingo out.